Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. I'm finally above 500 subscribers, and so you can mention me in videos if you like. I've got a backlog pretty heavily of videos to watch and comment on, so I apologize if you're one of those people that I usually watch and comment on and you haven't seen me for a while. It's because I've been doing a lot of writing, and then also a video game that came out I was very invested in. So my free time went to that instead of watching BookTube and commenting, etc. So for the first week of March already, it started off a little bit strange. I got The Promise finally. Damon Galgut book took, I don't know, 7-8 months, something like that, to get here. Finally got it. I ended up DNFing it anyway. So I think that's the second DNF of the year so far. Not too bad really, but I'm very surprised it was that book. The prose style just wasn't gelling for me. It was completely hard for me to feel anchored and connected to the story. Things just kept happening. I was very detached and I couldn't really process what was going on with the prose style. It's an odd style that I haven't encountered before, and I obviously just didn't gel with. I think I made it 50 pages in and then just decided to dip out. Next I read Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. This is a classic, or a modern classic, something like that. I have seen the movie already, and actually it's quite close to the book, so there wasn't too much new here. It actually is pretty more or less verbatim, but the additional context and the prose style were excellent. It still feels a little bit strange. So for those that don't know, this is about a trial of a Japanese man who is accused of killing a fisherman, and the story intermittently cuts between a courtroom drama, essentially, and the historical time period of which it's set, and going over the different characters, as well as the most pertinent moments, I guess you could say, contextualizing around the case. Mostly it's focused on prejudice, it's focused on how the war changed the perception of people in the town and at large towards Japanese people, and how they sort of were able to create the outgroup very easily, in this case for a rural small town, I guess. And there's some stuff about the war and some PTSD type encounters juxtaposed with the sweetness of coming of age and the bitterness of loss of innocence and love, and how the Japanese family and white family that are most connected in these stories are both same, similar, and quite different in their view of America and their bringing up. So it's very big on juxtaposing two certain ideas in order to create a dissonance and interrogate kind of the American dream as well as war and stuff like that. I gave it 4 stars. It exceeded my expectations. Had I not seen the movie already, and kind of, even though it was 20 years ago, maybe more, it would have probably made a much bigger impact, because the movie had already sort of done that for me. And it's something that I still recall very vividly. But again, in prose style, it's quite different. Still quite liked it, and it obviously surpasses the movie in that it manages to provide a lot more context, and because of this sort of problematic nature somewhat of the context around the Japanese family, the more information that you get, the better, and the book is obviously better at that. So something to keep in mind, definitely worth reading. Great prose, characterization, themes. It does feel dated in how it sort of makes the characters on the Japanese side almost quintessential, I would say. There's lots of talk of Geary. There's lots of talk of honor, talk of certain ideals that would be like stereotypical and synonymous and don't wholly allow for these characters to feel completely realized. But it's still, because of its intent being so blatant, I think is still worth a read and quite good. Next, I read Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily R. Austin, narrated by Emily Tremaine. This was a really great read, another 4-star read, exceeded my expectations. The narration was excellent, by the way, for this. It's about Gilda, a 20-something-year-old woman living with mental illness that I believe, at least in the beginning, is completely undiagnosed. She's not certain generally what's going on with her. She does make sort of inroads trying to figure out some of that stuff, but she's definitely neuroatypical and just essentially high on the verisimilitude. Like, she's just trying to live her life. It's very dark, very humorous, very much a laugh out loud read for me. I really enjoyed this book, even though there's not too much of a plot. She gets the crux of the story, I guess you could say, or the plot, is that she obtains a job in which the former person was ostensibly murdered, and there is a kind of arc that not supplants, but is the A plot, I would say, to Gilda's B plot, where the resolution of it is in tandem with her realization about herself. It's very queer. She's a lesbian. There's a lot of like the straights are not okay stuff in this that added to the humor. It's Fleabag kind of ish. Like, she's, even if she doesn't say it out loud, she's kind of like vulgar. And mostly it is simply about her conveying the things about her life that are important to her and kind of contributing to her mental stress, sometimes by way of a therapist that she is speaking to, sometimes just by navigating the world. And yeah, I wouldn't say people should go into this expecting a plot, but for people that like characters and characterization, if you specifically click with Gilda, this is a 4-star or a 5-star read. It was close to a 5-star read for me, but it definitely doesn't feel meaty, but it is highly enjoyable, very consumable, and very short. Next, I read The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. This book was another 4-star read, exactly what it says it is on the tin. I would say I have read quite a bit of books about this issue already, and this was still very surprising. So it is very granular in its intersections, go into so much detail about how designing a system that is directly anti-racist would benefit literally everybody, including white people, just in a similar way of designing for accessibility benefits everybody in every sense of the word. If you ever text, if you look at modern day architecture, if you pretty much interact with anything in the technological form or play video games, everything has benefited from accessibility. Conversely, everything has not benefited from racism, especially white people in rural areas who are the people that vote generally with prejudicial stuff like Trump. So there was a lot of stuff that was very surprising and that you could see how it was all connected. It's very tangential that way, though. If you're looking for like a core specific argument, I think this book kind of knows this is already out there and it's not specifically about that. She formulates the structure very well. Some of it is her personal life experience, some of it is her research, and some of it is direct quotes from her talking to interviewees of hers. If she's not particularly in the know about it or have a life experience, then she goes and finds somebody with that life experience and then puts it in the book. Great stuff. Then I read The Humans by Matt Haig. I actually own this book. I think I was given it at some point. This book I did not like. If you know my quibbles about the Midnight Library, this is exactly kind of similar to that, in that he has a very interesting concept in which there is a person who is ostensibly an alien possessing a professor of mathematics, I think it was, and is negotiating humanity, trying to figure out who knows this very specific secret, either science or mathematical or both based, and having to make certain specific decisions, as well as the reader having to figure out if he's an actual alien or not, or if he's got like a psychotic break thing going on or stuff like that. However, it morphs into a prescriptive based text that just simply wants to convey certain things, observations, aphorisms about living life as a human, and wants the reader to come away thinking specific things. There's an actual list near the 3/4 mark, I think, or towards the end, where it's just a list of all the things that like he recommends, likes, and thinks that humans should be doing, essentially. And it's just intersection of self-help and feel-good sweetness that is sickening to me, and I dislike immensely. I gave it 2 stars. I did finish it, and yeah, so I don't have to read any Matt Haig anymore because I finished The Midnight Library as well, which I think I got as a gift before, and that one's going to the Goodwill. Then I read Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen. This is my first Franzen. So how to talk about this? I gave this 4 stars. It exceeded my expectations. Again, not a book that blew me away in any way, but the construction of it is, you can tell, meticulous. It's very well plotted. It's about a sort of summer of love type hippie family who are religious, Christian. The father is a pastor, pastor's wife. They're all sort of archetypical, but recontextualized to fit a sort of like brokenness about them. And Crossroads is a community organized event, like youth group, basically, before youth groups. Ostensibly anyway. I don't really know anything about the history of youth groups, but it seems like they would just call it youth group instead of Crossroads, or maybe this is just the new hip thing. Like, it's specifically made, it is said, to appeal to the hippies and people who are like cool in groups and stuff like that. And it's more about empathy and connection in ways that are not traditional, essentially. And there's a loose plot that, when all is said and done, probably not that much has actually happened, but each chapter is a different viewpoint of a character, usually delving quite deeply into their past and informing the decision that they made, and then spiraling off from that. It continues to progress more or less linearly with this path of each of them being confronted with a faith-based crisis, I guess you could say, and then the fallout of that. This is the first of a trilogy, so there's like a lot of setup. I will say it did feel pretty self-contained. There is a bunch of questions that are interesting at the end to pick up the next book, but I feel satisfied had I not known that it was a trilogy, having just read this book anyway. And the thing that I thought was very interesting about it was, again, the brokenness of all of the characters and the contradictions that are placed within them, usually due to their faith. They believe very emphatically about something very in particular, and that usually creates like a prison of their own design, essentially. There is mental health issues also at play, and there is marital issues, coming of age issues. There wasn't anything too surprising in every plot beat, but everyone felt exceptionally nuanced, and I could see that in the next book, everyone having been so realized in this book, the complexity on the plot-wise front might be coming next book. However, why it wasn't a 5-star read for me was because the meticulous construction always suss out in the text, like the seams are showing. It isn't seamless. And so the sort of like perfectness of the arrangement made it feel almost a little bit sterile and removed for me. And so I wasn't able to completely inhabit the story as much as I would have liked to. Next, Permanent Astonishment, a memoir by Tomson Highway. And this was fine. I gave this as well 4 stars, but where this fell down a little bit as a memoir / biography, autobiography, is that he lacks a through line. Memoirs that are sort of the best usually have a kind of arc or really big theme that is, there's something at the center of it that makes everything else like centrifugal to it, which this lacked. It felt a lot like he just was doing what he was doing, and if you were interested, then that was great. It was sort of non-linear. It bounced around quite often. However, for me, I was interested in the things that he was talking about. It exceeded my expectations insofar as he, I think, toes like a very interesting line because, for one, I'm Canadian. I've lived on a Dene reserve. There's a lot of cross-pollination with his life and a different Dene reserve. So I was just kind of interested in that, especially with his age, where he was at. I haven't consumed a lot of stuff that interrogates Canada at that time period, so I always just find it fascinating. And then his residential school story is, I think, done quite well. I've heard some people say that he's like an apologist for residential schools because nothing bad happened to him, but they must be quoting somebody else because he talks about being sexually abused directly. It is certainly less grim as other residential school stuff, maybe. And he does sort of go on to say that he viewed everybody that he was with as a family member, and that the time with them meant a lot to him. He found his like faith there, so there was more positive things happening to him there, and probably the fact that he was assimilating in order to do that was a part of why he got on with things and wasn't sort of facing all the more negative aspects that the school would implement. And he doesn't talk about people going missing or running away as much either. So the school might have just been, run by people that were less sadistic and cruel, basically. But he talks about fishing, he talks about canoes, he talks about basically every facet of his life that he found interesting and compelling, and I just gelled with those things. But I could definitely see how some people would be like thinking this was tangential, meandering, and not something that they would completely gel with if they weren't interested in the exact same things. So, Ordinary Grace by William Kent Krueger. This was an excellent book. I gave this also 4 stars. This book kind of reminded me of Gilead, where it's like a interrogation of faith that centers a specific family and the tragic event that is centered on it, while it jumps back and forth in time interrogating the different characters. In this case, again, there's like a pastor's wife, and a strong themes around love and war and PTSD, fallout from that, prejudice towards indigenous people, and the juxtaposing of that against faith, which a lot of people extol the benefits of faith-based tenets, but then don't adhere to them in their lives. And then that sort of inherent contradiction creates drama in the story. This case, though, there's also a young girl who goes missing. That is sort of the main plot and mystery that occurs, though it happens somewhat, if I recall correctly, like 25-30% into the story. But I was enjoying it even before I knew that that's what had happened. I didn't know anything going into this except that AJ Dunn and Bookworm Adventure Girl really loved this book, and they were talking about it in such glowing terms that I didn't really pay attention to what they were saying and just stopped the video and then got it and read it because I didn't really want to know too much about what it was about. So there is the mystery, but then the main crux of it, I think, is how the two brothers, who are the basically main characters of this, deal with the disappearance and the rumination on justice and punishment and atonement, centered on surrounding the fallout and the feelings surrounding the disappearance and what happens later on in the plot. And it's able to form like a really interesting prose verse for it because, or prose work for it, because the man who is telling the story is reflecting on the events as a teenager, so it's not from the perspective of a teen. So the diction and the prose work, while kind of, I would say, simple, are more complex than you'd expect from like a teenage perspective, which I considered to be probably one of the reasons why I gelled with this so much. I generally don't like child or adolescent narrators. I just, while I can find them relatable, I just don't really like how they're characterized generally. And it's able to play with time in really interesting ways and drop like some narrative bombs, essentially. Title Ordinary Grace in the story becomes like a sort of pivotal moment with really good build-up. There's a lot of interesting philosophy that's ingrained in the book as well. And so it becomes, again, another story that could have been kind of like Crossroads, very archetypical, but drills down so far that it becomes more about like the human experience and human nature than the archetypical placement of these things in a plot. So, and that's it. That was my week in reading. I will see your videos soon, I hope, and otherwise I will see you next video. Bye.